This picture of the American that you see here is a stereotype, and this is a little bit exaggerated, but not far off the mark in my experience in how sometimes Americans are viewed abroad. They tend to be seen as eating hamburgers all the time, always drinking soft drinks. It's a byproduct of the spread of American fast food. That's what very often non-Americans see of American culture, and also what they see in movies, on TV, and they're sometimes surprised that we have other things to eat. I know I've been asked that question abroad many times, or curious about how many hamburgers we eat. But we're going to be talking about stereotypes, and we've talked about categories as a natural thing that people do, because when you see a person, we naturally try to fit that person into some kind of group, into some kind of category. And what happens then very often is if we put that person in a category and we don't have a lot of knowledge about that group, then we fall back on stereotypes that we've maybe gotten from movies, from TV shows, from jokes, that tend to be very superficial information about that particular group. And these characteristics that we have through stereotypes can be positive. So, for example, Asian Americans are stereotyped as being good at math. But very often the stereotype has a negative connotation and leads to prejudice and discrimination. The interesting thing is that these stereotypes are established early in life. There's a discussion of that in the text with 4-year-olds who already have some of these stereotypes. In the U.S., we tend to stereotype based on race and gender. We'll see an example of that in a minute. That's different in other cultures. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. But let's first show a very short clip, kind of a humorous take on stereotyping. Well, where do stereotypes come from? Well, there are a number of explanations, and there are a couple of terms that are important to note in this chapter in reference to stereotyping and racism and ethnocentrism. One of those is the outgroup homogeneity effect. And what this refers to is the tendency that we have to assume that people who are different than we are, in a different category, in a different group, that those people are all the same. Of course, in our group, we're all unique individuals, but this is kind of shown in social psychology as a fairly widespread phenomenon, that we tend to look at people in outgroups as all the same. And then there's something called the illusory correlation principle. And this refers to the fact that we tend to see some kind of negative behavior on the part of a person in an outgroup, a person in a group that we're not a member of, as representative of that whole group. And this might not be the case at all. This might be just an individual errant behavior, but we tend to take that as representative of the group as a whole. Why stereotypes? Well, it might be based on real conditions. So if there's widespread poverty in a group, that probably leads to certain characteristics, such as a lack of education, a lack of social mobility, poor job opportunities. And so that may be one source of stereotyping as well. There's also self-fulfilling prophecies. What's meant by that is if a dominant culture doesn't provide equal opportunities to people in microcultures or in other groups, then that sets up that group to have fewer opportunities and to maybe exhibit the kinds of characteristics that are evident in stereotypes. One action that one consequence of stereotyping that is on the positive side is that it helps to maintain and establish cohesion within the in-group because, as we've seen, we typically attribute very positive attributes and characteristics to our in-group. And so this helps to establish and maintain positive self-esteem. There's also something interesting kind of phenomenon called the stereotype threat. It's also something well known in social psychology. And this refers to people in outgroups who sense that, or aware certainly of a stereotype in reference to their particular group that they're in, and who sense that that there is some behavior on their part that matches that stereotype, and they tend to kind of reinforce the stereotype. And so, for example, the fact that that there's a stereotype about women that they're bad at math seems to be played out by women being very nervous about doing well in a math class. I know that that was the case with my daughter, who really actually was quite good at math, but she was sure that she couldn't do well because she knew that girls weren't supposed to be good at math, and that's what we mean by the stereotype threat. Stereotype content model. There are two aspects to this, and this is what this is. This stereotype content model is a way that it's been put together to try to identify cultures in terms of where these stereotypical views come from. And there are two questions that are asked. One is, does this person in this group intend to harm me? And there the associations are, if assuming that this is not the case, the associations are very positive. And on the other criterion that's part of this model is, are they capable of harming me? So the questions kind of sound very negative, obviously, excuse me, but the idea is that we have in the question of competence, do they have the ability to carry out any kind of negative behavior towards me? So these two qualities, these two characteristics are called warmth and competence, and in this model those two go together to characterize particular cultures. And you saw in the book the results of surveys that kind of group cultures according to those two criteria. And what comes out of that is very interesting. So on the one hand, we have groups that are very low in warmth and very low in competence. It's kind of the absolute bottom of the scale, towards which we feel some contempt. And then on the upper side, on the upper side of the scale, we have pride towards those people who are both warm and competent. And so what you see in the surveys is that in that low category, in other words, low warmth, low competence, the the stereotype is not surprisingly towards the poor, towards homeless people, towards people with drug dependence. In the United States, also towards Arabs, and this is certainly something that has arisen since 9/11. Competent but low warmth, in other words, people who are intelligent, skillful, knowledgeable, but they're not real high in terms of friendliness. Germany is in that category, and rich folks as well. It's interesting that in the category of high warmth but low competence is the neighboring German-speaking country, Austria. So those are warm-hearted people, but not as competent as the Germans. So that's a stereotype as well. Interestingly, housewives are in that category too. Ethnocentrism. What do we mean by that? Well, that's a tendency to put our own group above all others, and this is something that's a natural tendency for us to do. There really aren't people who are ethnocentric. It's really what we all tend to do. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It fosters patriotism, solidarity, cooperation among groups. So if we didn't have that sense that our country is really good, then would we have people joining the army? Would we have the kind of patriotism that's important? Obviously, ethnocentrism has a negative potential aspect to it as well. Extreme nationalism can lead to a lot of problems, obviously. So if we look at the scale here from kind of the positive to the negative, on the positive side you have patriotism, loyalty. Then on the negative side you have nationalism, and on extreme ethnocentrism, ethnic cleansing, such as the Holocaust, obviously, but also in more recent times, what has happened in Rwanda with the Tutsis and Tutsis. What's the other group? Escapes my mind for the time being, but also in Serbia, in the breakup of the Yugoslavia. Ethnocentrism, when we talk about that, there's another term that's important to note: ethnocentric attributional bias. What do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that, similar to what we were talking about before, with the illusory correlation principle, namely that we see the negative action of others as representative of that group, but we also see any positive action on the part of members of that outgroup as just a incidental behavior, not representative of that group as a whole. It's kind of an aberration, in other words. Obviously, ethnocentrism can have a profound effect on communication, and there's this term that's used, communicative distance, and there are kind of three aspects to that. What's called the communicative distance of indifference, and these are all consequences of ethnocentrism. And we're going to see a clip that illustrates this one in a humorous way, talking loudly or slowly to non-natives. Also, use of somewhat derogatory terms. Then we have the communicative distance of avoidance, use of slang that would not be understood by members of an outgroup. And then communicative distance of disparagement, using terms of open contempt and abuse, and there are lots of examples of that. So let's look at an example of the communicative distance of indifference, and this is maybe an example that you're familiar with. What we see in this clip is a humorous example of the communicative distance, first of indifference, talking loudly, and the use of enunciating the words clearly. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? And obviously not trying very hard to see if he's really being understood. Also uses a slight derogatory term, Mr. Rice-A-Roni. We're not seeing in this clip the disparagement that can be part of ethnocentrism entering into a conversation, but we do see this communicative distance of avoidance, the fact that that he's using some slang when he thinks that that Jackie Chan doesn't understand English. One of the things that often is a problem in conversations that Americans have with non-native English speakers is also the tendency for Americans not to take into consideration the possible limitations of other speakers' knowledge of English who are not native speakers. And this is something that we're going to be coming back to in Chapter 7 when we talk about language. And we're going to talk about briefly ethnocentrism in the workplace. Obviously can have negative consequences, and particularly in the world that we live in today, where there's a great diversity in the United States. And so there's ethnocentrism, where that emerges in the workplace is very often in job interviews. And this is a natural human tendency as well, that we tend to like people who are like us. That's just the way human beings are. And as a consequence of that, we tend to favor those people who have characteristics that are closer to the way that we are, our group is. Another potential negative effect of ethnocentrism in the workplace is also in relations between subordinates and higher-ups. So, for example, in evaluating in performance evaluations, this can be an issue that arises as well. This, of course, is a major issue in American society, but certainly is not unique to the United States by any means. Finally, what ethnocentrism can lead to on the extreme side is racism. And these are not equivalent terms. What we mean by racism is that it refers to this belief that one's race is in some way biologically superior to other races. And very often racists are racist towards a number of different races, and not just, for example, towards blacks, probably towards Jews, maybe towards Asians, maybe towards Hispanics. White supremacists, for example, usually will have those views. So ethnocentrism is something, as we've said before, that is natural, innate, and universal. Racism obviously is not. Racism is cultural. It's something that's learned. And there's this reference to the frustration-aggression hypothesis. What this refers to is the tendency in difficult, bad economic times, and such as we're experiencing now, to see more negative ethnocentrism and racism. And this is not surprising if we think about people who are unemployed and tend to believe very easily that that other people from maybe other immigrants, for example, are taking their jobs away. So it's very often the case in those kinds of situations that we see out groups as scapegoats.